we're going to go ahead and get started. I can invite Leah up to the stage. Okay. I'll give you. So on behalf of Busboys and Poets, thank you so much for joining us for this very important discussion about just action by Leah Rothstein. Busboys and Poets is a community where racial and cultural connections are consciously uplifted, and a space for art, culture, and politics to intentionally collide. Our Busboys and Poets servers, Akaya and Belize, will be helping us out with putting in orders throughout the program. I also want to remind you that there will be a Q&A and book signing after the discussion, and Just Action will be available. So I'll introduce Leah. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. Can you all hear me? This is okay. I can't tell that it's on. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for that introduction. So as you might have guessed, I'll be talking about racial segregation in this country, a bit about how we came to be such a racially segregated country, and then getting into the content of Just Action, which is all about what we can do to challenge racial segregation and to remedy its impacts on the local level in our own communities. So as was mentioned in the introduction, we have adopted this myth in this country that we are a residentially segregated society as a result of what's called de facto segregation, that it wasn't caused by laws or policies, but that we're segregated because of private actors, bigoted landlords. I can't even tell if this is on. Okay. Bigoted landlords or realtors who refuse to sell or rent houses to African Americans in white communities, or that we're segregated because of just personal choice. We like to live around people who look like us, and so we naturally self-sort into racially homogenous communities. We think, we look around and we see, every metropolitan area all around the country is racially segregated, particularly the segregation of blacks from whites is persistent all over the country. And we think it's too bad. Many of us think it's too bad that our country looks that way. But we think there's not much that we can do about it, because something that happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. The Supreme Court has agreed with this. Chief Justice Roberts has written in opinions that because the government had no role to play in creating segregation, it has no role to play in challenging or undoing it. So with that context, in 2017, my father, Richard Rothstein, wrote The Color of Law, and I'm just curious how many of you here have read The Color of Law, familiar with it? Okay, most everybody, great. So I'll just give an overview in case it's been a while since you read it, but The Color of Law basically argued that the de facto segregation idea is a myth, that sure, there were private actors, bigoted landlords and realtors, that helped to create segregation, but their actions were incentivized and often explicitly required by the government at all levels, local, state, and federal government, through explicit policies that required the segregation of our country, explicitly segregating African Americans from whites. Now, this segregation, the government policy that created it, as unconstitutional as the laws that segregated the South, the segregation of lunch counters and buses and schools, as much of a violation of the Constitution as those policies. And as such, once we reckon with that true history of how we came to be segregated and see that it was unconstitutional actions of our government that created and maintained segregation, we can see that we have an obligation to do something about it. When our government breaks the law, violates the Constitution, we have an obligation to remedy those violations, to correct them and remedy them. But so far, we haven't, as a country, stepped up to our obligation to remedy that. And part of the reason we think is because we don't really know how. It's not that easy to undo the decades and decades of government policy that created our segregated communities. So one example from the color of law of a very powerful government policy that created segregation came about after World War II, when millions of war veterans came home from the war and they started families. We had the baby boom. They were met with a housing shortage. The federal government wanted to do something to meet that housing demand for all these growing families. And what it did was help to create suburbs all around the country. Now, at the time, we weren't a suburban economy. Most people lived in urban areas, near factories that had to be near buses or ports and rail lines, and people had to live near where they worked because we didn't have the transportation and highway systems we have. So most people were in urban areas. The federal government stepped in to create housing for this increasing demand for housing by creating suburbs outside of the cities for white families only. And it did that through providing federally backed loan guarantees to developers to build these suburbs and subdivisions. A famous example is Levittown outside of New York City, built by a developer named William Levitt. He wanted to build 17,000 homes in Long Island, where there weren't people living there at the time. He didn't have the money to finance 17,000 homes. He couldn't get a bank loan to finance it because it seemed slightly crazy and speculative. He didn't have buyers lined up. People didn't live there yet. So the only way he could build Levittown was through a federally backed loan guarantee through the Federal Housing Administration. And the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, would only give him this loan guarantee if William Levitt promised to only sell his homes to whites. So they required him to put in the deeds of the homes that he built what are called restrictive covenants. It said that the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. Now, this was written in the FHA manual. This was not hidden. It was explicit policy. And it went even further. The manual said that as they were the FHA were sending appraisers around the country to determine which potential suburban developments were a good investment for the federal government. The appraisers were told that they shouldn't recommend any subdivisions or suburbs that were located even near where African Americans live, because the manual, and I quote, it said it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. So this was written in the manual, explicit government policy, not a secret, not sort of rogue bureaucrats doing this, creating this segregation. Now, suburbs around the country, the Levittown is just one example. Suburbs and subdivisions all around the country were created in the same way with the same restrictive covenants all over in the West, the South, Northeast, Midwest. These restrictive covenants are all over the country, required, again, by the federal government in the mid-20th century. Now, William Levitt, he was a bigot. He wasn't shy about that, and many other developers at the time were as well. William Levitt said if he were left to his own devices, he wouldn't sell his homes to African Americans. But the point is that he wasn't left to his own devices. If we can imagine an alternate history where the federal government instead told William Levitt, we'll give you this loan guarantee on the condition that you sell your homes on a non-discriminatory basis, things would look very different today in Levittown and around the country. Levittown today is 2% African American in a surrounding area that's 13% African American. So that disparity is due to the policies that were in place when Levittown was created that explicitly prohibited African Americans from living there. And since then, those restrictive covenants, they're not legally enforceable anymore. We now have the Fair Housing Act of 1968 that prohibits discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But it's somewhat of an empty promise when, African Americans who were prohibited from buying into Levittown when the homes were affordable. When Levittown was created, the homes sold for about $100,000 in today's money. It's very affordable for a working family. Today, those homes sell for about $600,000 in Levittown, and in suburbs and subdivisions around the country, more than that often. So those white families who were subsidized through their FHA-backed mortgages or VA, Veterans Administration mortgages, to get into those homes, built up wealth over the generations that they could use to send their kids to college or to enjoy their retirements or to pass on wealth to their kids and grandkids to buy their own homes. African Americans explicitly prohibited from building wealth the same way. So getting back to what I said, the empty promise of the Fair Housing Act, is that we can say that sure, anyone can buy in Levittown today, but it's not exactly true when white families have the advantage of inherited wealth to be able to afford the $600,000 homes because their predecessors were able to buy homes when they were affordable, when African Americans don't have that kind of inherited wealth to be able to afford homes. So that leads us to where we are today, where we have a huge wealth gap between African Americans and whites. It's due primarily to these government policies that allowed whites to build up wealth through homeownership and prohibited African Americans from doing the same. So the wealth gap is one ongoing, persistent consequence of segregation. There are many more. The segregation of our neighborhoods, they underlie many of our most serious social problems and most concerning and biggest racial disparities in this country. Due to segregated neighborhoods and the conditions of those neighborhoods, because when I talk about segregation and segregated neighborhoods, I'm not just talking about a benign separation of people, where some people live in this area and some people live in this area and all else is equal. It's also a separation and a segregation of resources. So children who grow up in segregated African American communities, they have more exposure to lead paint, to pollution in the air, they're closer to highways with trucks that spew pollution, and closer to factories and industries that also spew pollution in the air. So they have more health effects of that. African American children who grow up in these segregated neighborhoods, they grow up, compared to white children, to have higher rates of cancer, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and shorter life expectancies than whites. So this is not sort of a problem we can ignore. It has serious consequences on the quality of our lives and also how long we can live. This is what brought me to this issue, is that sort of every sort of social issue I wanted to work on as a young organizer came down to where we live and the communities that we live in and the opportunities and access we have based on where we're sort of allowed to live. So it has huge consequences to sort of all of our societal issues and problems that we likely, hopefully many of us in this room want to address and want to improve upon. So many people read The Color of Law. It was surprisingly popular. It continues to have a big effect of how we talk about segregation in this country. And as a result, this de facto myth has slightly less currency. I think many of us more clearly understand how we got here, how we came to be a segregated society, and we can more clearly see the consequences of the policies that created that. And again, once we do, we can see that we have an obligation to do something about it. That was the big call to action in The Color of Law, is once we recognize that government policies created this, we can see that we have an obligation to remedy it, to challenge the consequences of those policies. Well, my dad wrote that book in 2017. He traveled around the country talking about it for several years afterwards. And many people who read the book and listened to him talk, myself included, went up to him after his lecture and said, it's really important that we're reckoning with this history, but what do we do about it? It doesn't seem like there's a clear way forward of how we live up to this obligation and how we challenge segregation. So we wrote this book to answer that question. And what we write in Just Action is that in order to challenge segregation and remedy its impacts, we need a newly activated civil rights movement that is made up of groups in local communities all around the country that are educated around this issue about how we got here and activated and ready to do something about it. And we hope with Just Action educated about what they can do in their own local communities. So we describe dozens of examples of policies and programs that a local group can advocate for to begin to move the needle on these issues. And then for each example, we give an example or a story of somewhere in the country of a community that's successfully implementing that strategy. Because we want to show that it might be difficult, but it's not impossible, and there are people like us all around the country working on these issues and having some success. So, as I said, we advocate for starting an activated civil rights movement ready to take on racial segregation in our communities. We know that that is a big ask, but we might think we're sort of on our way to that. We had a racial reckoning in 2020 where 20 million people came out to march in Black Lives Matter demonstrations. 20 million is more than have ever come out for racial justice demonstrations in our country's history. But since then we've had sort of a backlash to many of the DEI programs that came out of that. A lot of people from those demonstrations, they went home, they put up lawn signs on their front lawns, they maybe started book clubs, or maybe their companies, hired DEI officers or issued letters to their shareholders promising to do better on issues of race. Not much has come of all of that. All of these lawn signs and book clubs and letters and sort of more performative acts, they're important to raise awareness, but they don't create the change that we need. So what we argue is that we have to take that as a first step and then go on to take action in our own communities. So then the actions and the policies and strategies we describe, they're all locally based issues. So we understand that we'll need federal policy change eventually, massive federal interventions and investments to really challenge segregation on a national level. But, we're pretty far from building the political will on the federal level to be able to do that right now, but we can build that political will locally. And even though the federal government had a large role to play in creating segregation, once created, to a large extent, it's local policies and programs that sustain and maintain that segregation. So there's a lot that we can change locally that will have a big impact. So to begin to build this activist, newly activated civil rights movement, we need to build biracial, multi-ethnic groups in our own communities ready to take on these issues. And we understand that in and of itself might seem daunting, because we live in such segregated communities. Many of us don't have contact with people of other races outside of our workplaces. Going about our day-to-day business in our neighborhoods, taking our kids to school, going to the grocery store, we tend to see people who look like us. And we argue that in order to build this movement, we need to sort of break through those barriers and start to build cross-race relationships that we can then use to organize and activate, advocate for change locally. So we give some examples in the book of communities that have done this, or groups that have brought people together from segregated parts of town and just start to build social relationships, because we want to show, again, might be daunting but not impossible. One quick story I have from Chicago is an artist there, a photographer, wanted to do a project around the segregation of Chicago, and she started by taking a map of Chicago, which is laid out on a perfect grid. So the north side of Chicago is mostly white, the south side is mostly African American. When you fold the map in half, the same street, with the north and south side of the same street, sit perfectly on top of each other, and the houses even have the same numbers. So she called the houses that sit on top of each other, in what she called the Folded Map Project. She called them map twins, and she photographed the homes to show that the homes aren't all that different, but they exist in very different contexts because of the segregation of those communities and the differing sort of resources of those communities. And she did a art exhibit showing her photographs, and then she went a step further and introduced herself to the residents of those homes and told them about her project and asked if they wanted to meet their map twin. Many of them did. Many of them had lived in Chicago their whole lives and had never been to the other side of town or known somebody from the other side of town. And so to take part in her project, they agreed to meet their map twin and go on a tour of their map twin's neighborhood and give their map twin a tour of their neighborhood. And in that way, they started to develop social relationships and realized that they actually had a lot in common, and started to learn and get curious about why their communities were so different. They then went on to form block twin groups, so the whole blocks get together now and they support each other. So this is an example of a way to bring people together. You don't need a perfect grid of a map to do this. There's lots of other groups and communities sort of replicating this idea of bringing people together from other segregated parts of the same city to just start to build relationships. And then with that sort of social capital built that way, you can then go on to organize for change. So what can we organize for? What can we advocate for to actually affect change around these issues? Well, as I said, we described dozens of strategies and policies, and they're two-pronged. So they both look to the future to ensure that we don't continue to maintain and perpetuate the segregation that exists, and they look to the past to remedy the impacts and the consequences of segregation, like the wealth gap that I described. These are ongoing consequences and disparities that exist because of the segregation of our neighborhoods, and if we want to truly challenge and redress segregation, we have to address those as well. So we have to look to the past and look to the future. And then they fall into two main categories. And the first category is strategies concerned with increasing investments and resources in lower income segregated, predominantly African American communities. And that is, these are areas that we want to create more opportunity, more access to opportunity, open space, access to jobs and transportation, quality housing. We want to sort of remedy the impacts of the lack of resources in those neighborhoods that's a result of their segregation. And we also understand when lower income neighborhoods start to see increased investments and resources, often people with higher incomes become curious in that neighborhood, they move in, we see gentrification happening, and the longtime residents of those neighborhoods are forced or priced out of the neighborhood. So these, what are called place-based strategies, need to be coupled with anti-displacement strategies so that we can prevent some of the displacement that occurs when we increase investments in these areas. So one example of these types of strategies is starting or expanding a community land trust. So there's over 300 land trusts in the country, or 300 communities with a land trust. They're nonprofit organizations. They're sort of they're getting a lot of attention and expanding a lot right now. They're a great model for addressing two things. They have two main goals. Creating permanently affordable, usually home ownership opportunities in areas with rising housing prices, and preventing some of the displacement that can occur in a neighborhood that's seeing rising housing prices and where gentrification is happening. We wrote about the Durham Community Land Trust in Durham, North Carolina. It was started by a group of residents who started by just going door to door, talking to each other. This is a predominantly African American, lower income part of Durham, located near Duke University. A few of the neighbors there just started going door to door, talking to each other about what they could do to improve conditions in their neighborhood. And the first thing everybody wanted to do was get a park in their neighborhood. There wasn't a park, kids were playing in the street, a child had been hit by a car, and so they wanted a city to turn the vacant lot into a park. And so they advocated for that, and they won. They got the park, and that got the group excited, and they started to look around to see what else they could do to help their neighborhood. The neighborhood was gentrifying at the time. Duke was expanding. Investors were buying their properties for the Duke community and pricing people out of this neighborhood. So this group, they learned about a land trust model, and they started with 2 vacant properties that the city donated to them. They started a land trust, and they got these 2 properties, they fixed up the homes, and they sold them for affordable prices to lower and moderate income households, about $100,000 in today's money, pretty affordable. And the way a land trust works is that in the transaction, when they sell the home, the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house. So in that way, the homeowner buys the house, and it's cheaper because land is a big part of the rising cost of housing. So when you take land out of the equation, the house is more affordable. And then the homeowner owns the home like any other homeowner. And when they want to resell the home, they agree to adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust sets, and every land trust sets it slightly differently. Sometimes it's by the change in inflation or area median income. They allow an adjustment for how long you've lived there for the house to is to allow the home selling family to earn some equity in the sale of that house. So it's a limited equity arrangement. They don't earn as much equity as they would if they sold the house at the market price. But in return, the home is affordable to the next home buyer. So that's how land trust can improve permanent affordability, which is otherwise very difficult to achieve in home ownership models and projects. So the Durham Land Trust started with 2 properties, now has over 300 all around Durham. A lot of rental properties and for sale properties. And their for sale homes now sell for about $150,000. So because of that equation and the desire to allow home selling families to earn some equity, that is becoming slightly less affordable over time. But the homes in the surrounding neighborhood sell for over $500,000. So they've retained a lot of affordability. And they've also prevented a lot of displacement in the neighborhood. The blocks where the land trust acquired homes are still mostly African American, and the surrounding blocks where investors outpace the land trust have almost completely gentrified, and most of the residents there are white. So we can see that this is a great model for creating permanently affordable homeownership opportunities, preventing displacement, and gentrifying communities. What can we do with this example? If there's a land trust here, which I believe there are a few in this area, we can support one individually or not. Okay. Anybody else? Well, the first thing we can do is find out if there's one in our neighborhood. And then support it individually through our own time, resources. And if there isn't one, help to start one. I've been visiting a lot of communities lately talking about this book, and there's a lot of communities that are starting a land trust, usually with the cooperation of the local government, often with the cooperation of the local government, because that's how land trusts acquire, or we start to acquire property. So what we can do, more importantly than what we can do individually, is what we can do collectively, and that is advocate that our local government donate vacant and unused land to the land trust to use in this way. There is no lack of opportunity for this. Local governments all over the country are sitting on vacant land, unused public land, or foreclosed homes that they could use in this way. And it's a great way for them to help create affordable homeownership opportunities in their community. There's also, we could go a step further. I mentioned those restrictive covenants that were on deeds of homes required by the federal government in the 20th century, no longer legally enforceable, but those restrictive covenants remain on the deeds of homes forever. So a lot of communities are starting to learn about, how their community came to be segregated by discovering and inventorying these restrictive covenants and finding out where they exist in their own neighborhoods. And I'll turn to questions at the end. Yeah, please. And often on those the restrictive covenants on those deeds, the deeds also name the companies that were involved with the sale of the house when it was first built. So the building and the sale of the house. The bank that financed it, the realtor that first sold it, the builder and developer that built it. Oftentimes, you'd be surprised, those companies are still operating in communities, or if they themselves aren't operating, they've been acquired by another company that is in operation in their communities. So a lot of these companies, we did some research on this in Charlottesville, Virginia, looked at restrictive covenants of those companies, the bank, the builder, the developer, and the realtor. They were all either in business still in Charlottesville or had been acquired by a business that was still operating in Charlottesville. Many of them had put in 2020 statements on their website, denouncing racism and discrimination and racial disparities and promising to do better. So a local group organized around these issues could find those companies and advocate, pressure them to live up to those statements on their websites and their obligation to remedy the segregation that they helped to create when they created homes that were sold on a discriminatory basis and created the segregation of those communities. So one way they can contribute to remedies is contributing to a land trust, with resources or land. So that's another way that collectively we can work for solutions and remedies for this issue. So that's one category of strategies that are sort of focused on lower income and gentrifying segregated communities. The other category of strategies we talk about are called mobility strategies, and they're concerned with opening up exclusive, expensive, usually predominantly white, usually suburban communities to more diverse residents. So we can do that in many ways, changing zoning to allow subsidies, rental or home ownership subsidies for people, African American families in particular, who've been historically excluded from those areas to be able to get into those communities. Inclusionary zoning is another policy that works well in all types of neighborhoods, and that's when local government requires that when new housing is built in an area, a certain percentage of the units have to be reserved as affordable for lower and moderate income households. The land trust is also a good strategy to use in exclusive suburban communities. We'll talk about it as a strategy for gentrifying areas because that's where land trusts often operate, because that's where they can acquire land. But if there were a group in a suburban area advocating for supporting a land trust and using unused land in this way that could donate suburban houses or unused land to a land trust to create permanently affordable homes for people who've historically been excluded from those areas. Again, there's no lack of opportunity for this. We write in our book about several communities around the country where the local government is now the owner of, in Woodbridge, Connecticut, they own a vacant country club. In Modesto, California, a golf course that went out of business. In Santa Monica, California, the local government is going to figure out what to do with a soon-to-be decommissioned Lincoln Airport. So these are huge pieces of land that local governments could devote a portion, at least a portion, to a land trust to build community affordable homes. Now we argue this is an important first step to creating affordable homes in these areas, and then we argue that we then need preferences, priorities, or at least some affirmative marketing to ensure that those units go to African American families who've been excluded from those communities if we want these strategies to truly be a tool for desegregation in those areas. Another way to open up exclusive, expensive areas to more diverse residents, like I said, is zoning changes to allow more than just single-family homes in those areas. Most of the only allowed in suburban areas, it's almost all of the residential land just allows one house per lot. This is single-family only zoning. It came to prominence when racial zoning was deemed unconstitutional. So it used to be that cities could zone areas by race to determine who could live there. And when the Supreme Court said that they could no longer do that, single-family only zoning took its place to ensure that areas that had ensure that the home prices in those artificially cap the number of homes that can be built. Keep the housing prices high, only the most affluent people more likely to be white can live there. So that's one big driver for maintaining and perpetuating segregation in suburban areas. So we do need to change zoning of those areas to begin to challenge that segregation. There's a lot of ways we can do that, and a lot of local states and cities and counties are changing their zoning to allow more apartments, particularly near transit or commercial corridors, to allow duplexes or triplexes on single-family only zoned homes, to allow what are called accessory dwelling units or granny flats to be built on the same property as a single-family home. So these are all local changes that can begin to expand the type of housing that an expensive area, predominantly white, exclusive suburban area, can expand its housing options and expand the affordability range of those households. Now I know that this isn't easy either. Often when we talk about changing zoning or building more dense housing in communities, particularly suburban communities, we are met with a lot of resistance. Often this opposition is called NIMBYs, not in my backyard, people who say that they agree with the need and goals of having more affordable housing until it's proposed in their neighborhood. So NIMBYs have been very successful in blocking housing, multifamily housing, affordable housing. They are loud, they're consistent, they show up at planning commission meetings and city council meetings. And we believe that there's also consistent loud support for building more housing opportunities in our communities, but we have to get out there and organize them and get that support out to these meetings and out to the voting boxes to promote and defend
the proposals for affordable and multifamily housing in our areas. And again, might be difficult, but not impossible. I wrote about a group in Silicon Valley, a very, very expensive area that, single family only zone, had no affordable housing, had no middle income housing. So teachers, 30% of the teachers in this community they left their jobs every year because they couldn't afford to live nearby. So the school district proposed to build teacher housing on a site that it owned, and the community tried to block it through a ballot measure that would have blocked this housing development and any future rezoning of a single family only zone lot in the city. So you would think that in a place like Silicon Valley that would win and we would never see affordable housing there. But what happened was there was a group that was already talking about these issues and educating themselves and each other about the history of how their city came to be segregated, all of the policies behind it. And when this ballot measure was proposed, they activated and they organized a no campaign for this ballot measure, and they went door to door every weekend. And they found more support than they expected, and they defeated the measure. And the teacher housing is being built. So I like to use this as an example. If they can do that in Silicon Valley, we can find the support anywhere. There's a lot of people that, if we agree with these concepts in general, we need to start acting in our own local communities and agree with them locally and get these changes enacted locally so that we can see a more diverse, more inclusive community. Another strategy that can help open up exclusive communities has to do with the Section 8 program. So the Section 8 program is the largest rental subsidy program in the country for lower income families. It's funded by the federal government and administered by local public housing authorities. Over 2 million low-income families get a Section 8 voucher. About a quarter of those who are eligible, so that's a federal issue that the program isn't funded enough to reach everybody who needs it. But the 2 million families who do get Section 8, that's still a lot of families. And the sort of idea and the intention behind the Section 8 program was because it's a mobile voucher, it's not tied to a unit, that it would help increase the opportunity and the access for lower income families to leave high poverty areas and move to what are called high opportunity areas with well-resourced public schools and clean air and access to open space, grocery stores, banks, jobs. But only 5% of Section 8 voucher holders can use their voucher to move to these high opportunity areas. So it's clearly not living up to its potential and its promise. And of that 5%, they're more likely white Section 8 voucher holders than African Americans. Even though African Americans are overrepresented in the Section 8 population, they're less likely to be able to use their voucher to move to high opportunity areas. One reason for that is just discrimination. On the federal level, it's legal to discriminate against a tenant because they use Section 8 to pay their rent. But many localities, including DC, have what's called a source of income discrimination ordinance that outlaws that kind of discrimination. So you can't discriminate against a tenant here just because they use Section 8 to pay their rent. But as we know from anti-discrimination ordinances, having one on the books is just the first step. It's still often violated, those ordinances all around the country where they exist. And so it's up to fair housing organizations and local civil rights organizations to ensure that these anti-discrimination ordinances are enforced and monitored. And the main way that they do that is by what's called paired testing, where they send two potential tenants to look at a unit or to apply for a unit that's listed as for rent. Some might say they use Section 8, some say they don't, and you can see how if they're treated differently, that's really the only way to know where discrimination is occurring. And these fair housing organizations that do this testing, they need volunteers, or sometimes they pay a small amount to their testers, but they need people to be able to do this kind of testing program. And so that's another way that individually we can, volunteer or contribute to these remedies to help find out where discrimination is occurring. And so then it can then be prosecuted and hopefully stopped. I believe the organizations here that work on that are the Equal Rights Center and the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And if you look them up, I'm sure that you can find out ways to become a tester or to contribute to their testing program. So I'm going to get to questions in just one second. I want to give one more example. I talked about some strategies that are focused on lower income or gentrifying communities, and some focused on higher income, higher cost suburban communities. And then there's strategies that span all types of communities, and many of those have to do with increasing homeownership opportunities for African Americans in every type of community. And there are obvious ways, that African Americans are disadvantaged in the home buying process. The lack of inherited intergenerational wealth, for example, to pay for a down payment is a huge hindrance to being able to get into home ownership. And so there's a lot of programs that offer down payment assistance, grants, and loans. We argue that they should be race targeted, so those programs should be explicitly targeted to African Americans to remedy for the effects of past policies that have made it impossible for them to have enough wealth to pay for a down payment. But there's other ways that are less obvious ways that African Americans are disadvantaged when it comes into getting into home ownership. And one of those is the credit scoring system. So we think of the credit scoring system as an objective system. It's an algorithm, so it must be true. It's, takes some information and it gives an objective rating of how well your likelihood of repaying a debt in the future. So how qualified you are to get a mortgage or a credit card. If you have a high enough credit score, you'll qualify for a mortgage. If it's even high enough, you might get a lower interest rate if you have a very high credit score. So that's great. But the way the credit scoring system works is it takes information about your financial history and it feeds it into the system that gives you a score. Now that makes some kind of sense. If you have defaults on loans in your past financial history, maybe you shouldn't get a loan in the future, or maybe banks would want to look closer at you, so you'll have a lower credit score. But if you don't, the problem with the credit scoring system is it just takes into account a certain type of financial history, and it's a type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. And that's because of the consequences of segregation. African Americans are more likely to live in communities or neighborhoods that don't have a bank branch. When you don't have a bank branch, you're less likely to have access to traditional lending tools like credit cards offered by that bank or even a bank account. And you might be more likely to rely on things like payday lenders because they are in your community. If you borrow money from a payday lender and pay it back, even with their exorbitant interest rates, if you pay it back in full and on time, that kind of financial history and performance isn't factored into your credit score. The only financial history that's factored into your credit score is what are from traditional financial tools like credit cards and banks and mortgages. So if you don't have access to those through no fault of your own, but just from the neighborhood you live in, you are less likely to have a credit score at all and far less likely to have a high enough credit score to qualify for a mortgage. So another piece of this is, if you've owned a home in the past, but your mortgage payment information is fed into the credit scoring system. But if you've never owned a home and you've been a renter your whole life and paid your rent on time, paid your utility bills on time, that isn't fed into the credit scoring system. So African Americans more likely to be first-time home buyers without a mortgage payment history, but they all, have rental payment history. If that were factored into their credit score, they would more likely have a high enough credit score to qualify for a mortgage. So there are a lot of conversations and pilot programs and some changes happening on the federal level or the national level with the three credit scoring companies to start to factor in on a voluntary basis rental payment history. So there's some movement happening around this nationally. But these conversations have been in the works for like 15 years, and the pilot program was just introduced a year or two ago. So it's a slow change. And while we're waiting for that national change to happen, we can work locally in our own communities, working with our local banks and credit unions so that to advocate that they start factoring rental payment history into their credit scoring algorithms. And many have on the bank branch level. We wrote about some in Just Action. There's many more around the country that are starting to do it since we wrote the book. And that goes a long way towards increasing mortgage and homeownership access, particularly for African Americans. So this is another important thing we can do to begin to redress segregation and its impacts. So those are a few examples, many more in the book, many more we couldn't even fit into the book or that we've learned about since or that have been like, the whole kind of field is changing and evolving every day. So we're continuing to write about these issues and update what we wrote about in Just Action on the Substack column that you can subscribe for free. It's justaction.substack.com. I hope that this talk and the book, if and when you read it, just gives you the message, the idea that while segregation does, it is an overwhelming sort of seemingly intractable issue and problem in our country, that there's actually a lot that can be done to challenge it and remedy its impacts. And just like there were a lot, many, many actions and policies and programs and actors that went into creating segregation, there's going to be just as many that go into undoing it. And so there isn't sort of one silver bullet, one thing we can do that will fix everything. We just have to start on these smaller incremental changes and they will eventually have a big impact. And so it doesn't really matter where we get started in any community, just that we get started somewhere. So I think I will stop my talk now and leave time for questions, but thank you so much for being here and for listening.
All right, so we've got a question from our online audience. Everyone say hi, online audience. That was better than I anticipated. Thank you guys so much. All right, we got Lance Warren, who says, Rothstein's recent blog post about zoning reform notes risk of displacing communities of color. What sort of policies should we advocate for in our towns, neighborhoods, etc., to reform zoning without additional displacement?
Yeah, so I did recently write a column about the studies that have been done recently about zoning changes around the country, particularly Minneapolis. It was the first city to get rid of single-family only zoning. And what they found in Minneapolis is, and in other cities that have reformed their zoning and built more housing, is that less displacement occurs. So when they compared Minneapolis and Houston, which also complicated. They don't have zoning, but they changed their policies to allow more than one unit on a lot and built a lot more housing. So both of these cities increased their housing supply while other cities around the country, most large metro areas, have not increased their housing supply in the last several years. And when you compare those two cities to all the other cities, those two cities have increased their housing, kept their rents down, and increased their African American populations. While other cities, have not increased housing, rents have gone up dramatically, and they've lost African American population in those cities. So increasing zoning, producing more housing is one way of preventing displacement and actually maybe turning the tide around, because we just need more housing options, more affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, I don't just mean low income housing. I also mean what's called missing middle housing, middle income housing. It's, a dangerous sort of generalization or idea we have in this country that African American and low income or poor is the same thing. And so if we build low income housing, that's meeting the need for African American families. Most African Americans are middle income. They don't fall into this low income category. They make too much to qualify for subsidized low income housing, but too little to afford market rate housing. So these zoning changes that allow more middle income housing to be built can really change, the composition of those neighborhoods and provide more housing options for middle income African American and other families.
Thank you, Ms. Ralston, for your outstanding book here, Just Action. My name is Jeff Kennedy. I work on issues of scientific racism international. And I actually as I was looking at the back of your book, I just attended a Capitol Hill meeting with Lisa Rice.
Could you speak into the mic a little bit more?
Okay.
There's a lot of ambient noise out
So, okay, got the feedback now. Actually, I don't need no money.
Oh, it's for also the live stream.
Oh, for the live stream.
Here.
Okay.
Sorry, we'll turn it.
Okay. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm thinking about. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I don't actually work in housing issues per se, but I do have a lot of friends academics who write in different areas, and they look to me asking questions about race and racism as it pertains to housing. And I wanted to know, in your research, did you ever come across Richard Eli? Excuse me? Yes.
I haven't, no.
Okay, and Richard Eli, when he dealt with the Realtors, National Realtors Association, where they wrote all of this, what you're saying, into policy. So sometimes we gotta just go back a little further in between that gap between Plessy versus Ferguson and I use Buck versus Bell 1927 as my demarcation line for the 20, so the 1924 Racial Identity Act. So I was looking at the legislation that you discussed in the book and coming to a question. It's basically from the late 18th century to Brown versus Boyd was the eugenics movement. And the eugenics movement decided that we were going to separate by housing, that they were going to build bridges, they were going to build parks and railways. If you lived across the railway, that was intentional. They thought that by blood, they needed to separate the feeble-minded from those who weren't feeble-minded. So looking at those policies and how they affect education, healthcare, housing, economics, when do we, this is the question, when do we start doing actual work that will change this 100-year movement that's still roaring, just absolutely roaring with Donald Trump right now? And when do we stop laying the groundwork for him to stop becoming president of the United States again? No, that's not your question, but I just had to get that out of there. Yeah. So that's the question. I mean, we have this long history, and to solve it, we got to get to the root of it. What's at the root?
I mean, I think we start working on all of it now. I think it's all interrelated. You know, we start addressing the segregation of our communities with these seem like incremental changes, and then they start to change the composition of our communities. We start to live around each other, understand each other better, break down some of the assumptions and, hundreds and hundreds of years of learning about, what we think about other races. We start to break down those walls. And I think that is an essential piece of getting past this, of moving forward, is that we have to live around each other and interact and be neighbors and see that we have common interests and common goals, that, we aren't sort of, our interests and needs aren't at odds with each other. That when we sort of lift up our communities and we all live in our communities and we're all lifted up together. And I think that it's all related. I don't know how to separate doing that from beating Trump and from challenging all of the sort of racist ideologies that have existed for a long time. I think it all has to happen together.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mara. I'm from Evanston, Illinois. I went to elementary school through high school with Robin Simmons, who started the reparations movement. And I can't help but think underneath all this, the foundation of this is reparations. There's a lot of talk about working with the community and doing this and doing that, and ultimately a down payment on a house, or money towards an education. Like, it's very black and white thinking, and I acknowledge I have black and white thinking, but I really don't think it's that complicated. I think to repair is, and it talks about it in the Old Testament, is to ask the person who you've harmed, what can I do to make wrongs right? And the Black community has said reparations. So all these other things we're trying to do is not what they asked for. All these committees, all these things, all these that. So for me, it's very black and white. If the community has asked for this, then I know this is kind of pushy. I think white people should pay reparations, and I pay reparations every month. And I feel that that is the answer, and I'm not trying to disregard all the community work and all these things we're trying to do. But I think when it comes down to it, it's not what we think, it's what they think. And so my question is I haven't read your book, I fully acknowledge this. You talk about reparations in your book, and what are your thoughts about what I'm saying?
We don't use the term reparations for reasons that are explained in the frequently asked questions in the book. Partly because I think the term is evolving in how we use it since we wrote the book, since we finished writing it 2 years ago. But at that time, it referred more to reparations for slavery. It referred more to monetary payouts. And we wanted to not sort of limit what we're advocating for to those things. We believe that we need repair remedies for the policies enacted since slavery that were in violation of the Constitution. And to remedy that, we need both monetary and policy change. And so we talk about redress and not reparations for that reason. Also to create a larger umbrella for an audience for this book. And some people aren't ready to confront the idea or even the word reparations. And in order for us to get there, we need a large enough audience reading this book and starting to enact these smaller changes. And so in terms of my opinion about what you said, I think we do need, I personally, and my dad and I disagree about some of this, but around the term, but we do need to get there. But I don't think we're going to get there overnight. We're not going to go from where we are now to having a full reparations program. And so, you know, the only way we can get there is start to build these groups and start to organize on winnable, achievable victories locally that can then lead to something larger.
Thank you. My name is Susan. This just couldn't be more timely in terms of what's going on right now in our community. On the Maryland side, I'm thinking specifically on the Maryland-Tacoma Park side. There are two things happening. And you answered an important question about one of them. And that is that our local history organization, Historic Tacoma, which works across Maryland and DC, is focusing on helping people identify covenants and expunge them, learn how to get them off of your deed. And in fact, at 7:30, you can go over to Historic Tacoma and join a workshop that's about that issue. You also can look at Historic Tacoma's website because there's a whole section there. And in my own mind, I've been thinking, well, you know, what's really the point? Okay, it might make you feel better about your house, But what does that really do? I think where you led me is that's just the first step. It's really getting into the history and understanding what the story is and how that's being carried forward. So that's very helpful. The other thing is that Montgomery County and Tacoma Park are considered very progressive. There's a tremendous need for additional housing in Montgomery County. And so the county planning board, and now our city government has endorsed this too, is to focus on what they call upzoning, increasing the heights of buildings that can be built, the apartment buildings on 2 large sections of land. One is where the Defense Hospital was, and the other is along Lower Maple Avenue, which is the densest, one of the densest collection of affordable housing stock in the whole county. And the upzoning there, which seems very counterproductive, is to allow developers to come in and build much taller buildings. And there will inevitably be an incentive to tear down a lot of the affordable buildings, which don't need to be torn down, they need to be upgraded, but not torn down. And it would be okay to build new buildings, accepting that we do have rent stabilization in this community, but rent stabilization won't kick in until after 5 years of a building being at market rate, a new building being at market rate. And at that point, is it going to be affordable? No. And there's been a lot of public outcry about this, but our county council is going to vote on Tuesday to go ahead with this plan. And we're talking about, do we try to sue the county? What do you do? I mean, theoretically, and we have a county executive who's very much against the plan and really on our team, but I don't know if this is going on in other places. It's a lot of it is because the city needs more revenue. And so by bringing in people who can pay their way, it will increase the tax revenue coming into the city. And that's an unspoken justification for it. And I don't know what suggestions you might have, or if this is going on in a lot of other places, but it's very frustrating.
Yeah, it is not an uncommon, most places that are building housing are building very expensive, luxury, high rent housing because it's expensive to build housing and because they can charge that because there's a housing shortage in general. So, I don't have like a quick fix for you except the long work of voting in new people who will support your long-term agenda and vision. And I think there's an inclusionary ordinance here in Montgomery County that requires that some percentage of the units are affordable. So that's one way of ensuring that there's some affordability built in. 15%. And they do have a fund in Montgomery County that's helping build fund market rate developments that then require 30% affordable. So there is something. There's a lot happening here to try to mitigate some of what you're talking about. It's not perfect, and to your first point about the restrictive covenants, also this is happening in a lot of communities around the country. A lot of interest in looking at and inventorying, mapping out the restrictive covenants, and then a lot of energy into what they can do to get those wiped off the record. I agree that it might feel better to have them gone off of the deeds of homes, but it doesn't actually change anything. And so we need to either refocus the energy to something that can have an impact on the consequences of those restrictive covenants, or use the energy built around those sort of campaigns and volunteer efforts to then feed into something. I'll give another example. Washington State recently enacted what they call the Covenant Homeownership Act. They had volunteers inventorying the racially restrictive covenants around the state. They've identified 50,000 so far. They used that information to then inform legislation that went through the legislature the first try
It puts a $100 fee on every real estate transaction that goes into a fund that will then provide down payment assistance to families and descendants of those who were excluded from housing by the covenants. So that information, the research on the covenants, can be used towards enacting policies that can have an impact. I would also argue, and we argue in the book, against wiping them completely off the record, because there is a benefit to having that historical record. If they weren't on the deeds of homes, a lot of these communities that have started to organize around these issues wouldn't have started to. They wouldn't have seen the evidence in black and white of how their community came to be segregated. Once you see that, you see how intentional it is, it gives you some, energy, agency. You can start to see that intentional action can undo it. It wasn't an accident, it's written there on the deed. Let's do something to change the impacts of that in our community. If that's gone from the record, there's less evidence, less motivation to do something about it. So it's a balance to strike.
There is I'll just say this one last thing, there is a countywide effort on the part of Montgomery County. It's called mapping segregation. And so they have been really trying to elevate an awareness of covenants, red line, all that kind of thing across the county.
Great.
Thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it, and I think you really spent a lot of time bit by bit enlightening us as to everything that's going on, and that was very helpful. I was very impressed several years ago. It's a father become an excellent book. What I wanted to say is someone mentioned the word reparations. Over the years, that's become an ugly word. You don't talk about it and expect any success. It's a little too aggressive. But I think what's missing in all of these conversations is the fact that it just took a private citizen who worked for a government agency to put a covenant in and work with people he knew, or she knew, and we are where we are today. Getting rid of the covenants is very important, but I think higher levels of government have a role to play. And we haven't talked much about that today. We always need to talk about what we can do, but I think higher levels of government have a role to play in leading this whole thing about reparations. The fact that when you were talking about the land trust, excellent strategy, but why should I stop? You know that my house is still 100,000 and the matching house is 6. And I'm now working on baby steps to make the change. But it took a stroke of the pen to get us where we were based on racism. So all I wanted to say is I'm glad we had a chance to come. I enjoyed your talk. I'm going to buy your book. Everything that we talked about today needs to happen. But let's not put our government at whatever level. Let's not get them off the hook. Let's not take a deep breath when the word reparations is mentioned. And let's encourage every strategy we've heard about tonight. I think that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned earlier those who are trying to undo as opposed to those who are doing. I know that there are a lot of people who are concerned after the Supreme Court ruling about affirmative action and the current lawsuit against the Victories Fund. What kind of adjustments do you feel need to be made in the current judicial climate?
Good question. We have a chapter in the book about this very question. It's called Dare to Defy, and we challenge readers to have the courage to defy what they think will be the Supreme Court's opposition to any race-based remedy. And we lay out the whole history of the Supreme Court's flip-flopping on racial equity issues and argue that it has never had a consistent stance towards advancing racial equity, and so we shouldn't expect it to stay consistent, and we shouldn't sort of defer to the Supreme Court as the last, the only answer on these issues. And we can argue that because of the government actions that created these disparities, we're obligated and entitled to enact remedies specifically addressed to those those government actions. So what we say is we need race-specific remedies for race-specific crimes, and that can be defensible in court. It might be challenged legally, and then we can defend it, and if we lose, we'll have some case law and some dissents in our favor, and that's how we will get the court to change, and that's how we'll advance these efforts. We give, the example of anti-abortion movement folks who, when Roe v. Wade was the law of the land, passed anti-abortion measures in violation of that decision until it got back to the Supreme Court and they got the decision they wanted. But those of us on the left working on racial equity issues, sort of have less, we tend to defer more to what we think the Supreme Court will say about what we're doing, and we should have the same courage to enact the remedies that we think are required and legally and constitutionally sort of demanded, and that then that's how we'll get there. So there's more, in the book around all of that, but that's sort of a short answer. And there are, I understand that's sort of a high ask for a lot of policymakers, and there's things that are being done, kind of in the meantime, or ways to use current laws to enact race-based programs. So like the Washington State program I mentioned it's what's called a special purpose credit program, which is allowed under federal law that allows financial institutions to have a race-based financial product, a down payment assistance program or a loan product that's targeted by race if they can do a study showing that racial group has been disadvantaged by the financial system. Not hard to do. This has been on the books since the 70s and it's not very widely used. Banks are starting to look at enacting them now. They're not, I don't think, doing them very well. So there's a lot of work to be done and law we can use now to enact race-based solutions. And Washington State is the first public agency doing that, enacting an SPCP, so we can replicate that and sort of expand the kinds of programs that can be targeted by race under existing law while we challenge sort of what we think will be blocked by the courts.
Okay, now I think we'll do 2 more questions.
So I just want to say thank you so much for this book and for your first book. It really changed my life. I'm a planner. I've been a planner and a planning director around the Beltway for 30 years. When I first became a planner, I worked for local jurisdictions my whole life. I did not want to work for developers. I did not want to be a consultant. I wanted to be the one who negotiated with the greedy developers for more parks, more schools, for the local jurisdictions and local communities. And I thought I was doing good. And now I found out, oh, whoops, my whole life I've actually been supporting single-family zoning, which has single-handedly created more, and more to the point, that the government that I thought was doing good and was there to do good, which was the local government, but that the federal government, the state government, and the local governments were basically all conspiring to create racial segregation during my whole career, which was shocking to me, but enlightening. Thank you for that. And second of all, I just wanted to say to the people here who are worried about Maple Avenue and the Adventist hospitals, it's not basically the multifamily that you have to worry about. Maple Avenue is a worry, because losing that affordable housing would be a disaster. But in fact, the multifamily buildings, whether they're affordable or not, as you point out in the book, have always been much more integrated than the single family neighborhoods. And that's where the change needs to come. I see the biggest change coming there. It's the zoning. I've worked with zoning, since forever. And it never crossed my mind. I did not understand how or why they were so segregated. So that's been a real eye-opener, and it's great to hear that in Texas and in Minnesota, they have changed that zoning and it actually has had an impact, because I think that is helpful to everybody else in the country, because there's a huge amount of resistance. And we need to, all the planners, we need to work on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the book and for doing this work. It's really important. I want to follow up on some of the things that we covered, including your comment just now.
in Montgomery County and in Virginia suburbs and all over the country, I think there's a real effort by local governments to increase housing by doing some of the things you talked about, increasing the number of units you can build on a single lot, so duplexes, quads, that kind of thing. And what I've heard in my own neighborhood and a lot, and also this is an argument made very broadly, is that what developers will typically do if there's no requirement to build affordable housing, they will come in and build a duplex or a quad where the replacement units are more expensive than the single family house that they are replacing. And so you increase density, but you don't increase affordability and also maybe don't reduce segregation in the process. And I guess I wondered is there anything to that argument? And what is the best kind of pushback against that kind of argument?
Yeah, we don't really know. So there haven't been that many communities that have gotten rid of their single family only zoning long enough to have an impact. Minneapolis is the only one, and their zoning changes that had the biggest impact weren't changing single family only zoning. It was allowing apartment buildings near transit, near commercial corridors, and having minimum height requirements in those areas and getting rid of parking requirements. But in Minneapolis, when they changed single family only zoning, they said, okay, now you can put 2 units on this lot, but they have to fit in the same building area as the original home. So it doesn't actually make sense. So not a lot of duplexes have resulted. So this is where like the intricacies of the zoning laws are very important. But when the Minneapolis zoning change was being debated in the city, the proponents were saying it would, improve reduce segregation of the neighborhoods, improve housing affordability, and opponents were saying it would, reduce segregation. They were both arguing the same thing. So to your point, the ones who were opposing the zoning change were saying that if this allows duplexes, they're just going to be very high-end luxury duplexes and just create more expensive housing. But we just don't know if that. We haven't seen that happen yet. There haven't been anywhere that it's happened long enough. But there are ways, I think, of addressing that, like allowing to take up more of the lot size, for example, that can reduce the cost of building the housing or allow even more units. And there is some argument to just, smaller units tend to be naturally more affordable than really large homes. So even if they still aren't, meeting the need of lower middle income families, they're meeting the need of more affluent families who then free up other housing so we just generally in this country need more housing of all types, and then we need to work on like the details of all of those zoning policies to make sure that they're meeting all of the needs of everybody in our communities.
Okay, so give it up one more time for your last one. We'll be playing Just Action over at the selling table along with the color of law if you would like to purchase, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.